Good afternoon, everyone. It's indeed a great pleasure to welcome all our listeners and our viewers to this webinar based on a book that Namita Gokhale and I have co authored. Here is the book. This is Betrayed by Hope, a play on the life of Michael Madhusudan Dutt. It hasn't been a very long time that this book has been out in the public, but I think has had good luck because many people have very affectionately responded to the book and found new and exciting material in it. Usually, those who do not read Bangla, they have been happy to get information about Michael Madhusudan's life and his works through the play that we have created. Namita and I have done three books together, and usually collaborations in the literary world are not easy. But I must say that for me, it has been entirely joyful to work with Namita, and I hope she believes the same because we're still very, very good friends and planning the next book together again. The interesting thing about this play is that we were both fascinated by the character of Michael Madhusudan Dutt. And in fact, it's Namita who brought the letters to my notice. But the letters were so powerful that we were wondering how to integrate the material of the letters with the material that is in the literary production of Michael Madhusudan Dutt. The only way to do it seemed to be to create a play around this character using his own words in the letters and dovetailing it with the fictional part of the play, which was through a sutradhar who is a Bengali researcher. To say something on the personal note, Namita and I did the book on Sita. We did another book on Radha. And the Michael Madhusudan book took much longer than both these books put together. We started this about 9 years ago, and it was only during the COVID pandemic, isolation, and long hours at home that we were finally able to talk many hours on the telephone and send printouts to each other's homes. And the book actually ended in this final production. So, thank you very much for everyone joining in. And I'll ask Namita to say what she thinks about the collaboration and her fascination with Michael Madhusudan Dutt.
Well, I hope you can all hear me. It's for me, I responded to Michael Madhusudan Dutt not as a scholar, not as a lover of the Bangla language, because I'm not acquainted with it, but as a novelist. I was first fascinated by the personality of this difficult, contrarian man, this self destructive man, and of the script he wrote out for his own life. I share a sort of overlap of a birthday with him. I used to love to drink cognac like he did. I thought of this man very often after I read those letters. And in no particular direction, but I knew that those letters had to be made into a play. As far as my collaboration with Dr. Malashri Lal goes, we are very, very old friends back to when I was in college and she was teaching me, though she was just about very few years older than me. And our last book was Radha and Sita. Well, Radha might veer more towards Madhusudan, but Radha, nothing can be further than the subjects of Sita and our dear friend MMD, as we call him. It involved a lot of creative imagination, a lot of empathy, a fair amount of scholarship, of piecing the words together. And at one stage in the script, to give it a completion and closure, I and Mala together, we worked on the closing lines, which tried to, well, not mimic his voice, but mimic the literary style of the times. And that was how it happened. I mean, it was about how distant events like romantic poetry in England and Europe can influence a young man in Calcutta, as it still does off and on. I mean, distant drum beats do make us march towards them. And then the search for the mother tongue, the return to one's own roots, all the more confident for having ventured out and seen more of the world. It's really to return where we began and see the place for the first time. So I'm very, very delighted to have such a wonderful panel of people who have engaged with the book and with the subject in their different ways. And I'm eager to hear more from all of them. So thank you, Harish, Aruna, and Arjun for being here with us.
Thank you, Namita. Before we move on to the others, maybe it would be interesting for our viewers to know how you chanced upon the letters of Michael Madhusudan Dutt, because that really forms the crux of the book. And he was an innovator, the first person to create an epic structure for Bengali poetry, the first person to write sonnets in Bangla, the tremendous faith that he had in the Bengali language, though he began as a writer of English influenced by Milton and Byron. So the letters.
So the letters happened like this. In 2004, which seems a lifetime ago, I was asked to review, for book review, I think, the two books, Lured by Hope and The Heart of a Rebel Poet by Ghulam Rashid. And these had to carry with them, they had the letters, they had his life. And when I read the letters, it was as though I could hear Michael Madhusudan Dutt speaking to me. It was an extraordinarily moving experience. And I began struggling there and then to fit these into a play because they quite naturally resolved themselves into five across the trajectory of his life. So it just happened. And then, of course, you were there, Mala, to help it happen even more. And so many friends and readers and just people who believed that these two ladies could sit down and write a play script. It meant a lot.
Yes, it was a very fascinating way the structure evolved, because neither Namita nor I had actually written a play before. So somehow the structure resolved itself quite magically. Harish, may I turn to you? It's indeed a great pleasure to have you on this panel. I think everyone who's listening in knows you, but yes, I do want to remember your great contribution to post colonial studies, the pioneering role that you took in translation studies, and how you showed the way by doing very important translations yourself. And you continue to be the leader in a lot of intellectual deliberations that go on globally, particularly for post colonialism and translation studies. You're just the perfect person to talk about Michael Madhusudan Dutt. Although not a Bengali, you learned Bengali because of your interest in translation. And you do read Bengali very well, Harish. So, what is it about Michael Madhusudan Dutt that attracted you? Is it the hybrid nature of this person, this writer, this duality, the pull of many languages, but particularly English and Bangla? Is it the theatricality of the man, the way he postures and positions himself in the letters, and probably did so in his life? What did Michael Madhusudan Dutt mean to you, and how does the play speak to your sensibilities?
Uh, Thank you, Mala. Uh, Thank you and Namita for producing this wonderful book. First of all, congratulations. I was utterly riveted when I was reading it. I got so much out of it. As a student of uh, Indian literature, and particularly a person interested in the history of Indian literature, I had come across Michael before. I had read him in translation. I knew a bit about his life, and I knew. Well, actually, I actually read a whole book. I haven't read many books, whole books in Bengali. I've read poems, I've read short stories, but one of the very few full books that I've read in Bengali, without Hindi, without English, was Krishna Kumari by Michael, which was 30 odd years ago. That's because I was writing on Krishna Kumari. But when I came to your play, I realized many things about Michael for the first time. He is a man of so many parts, and he is a man of such intrinsic attraction, the personality itself. Mala, in your introduction, you used the word powerful about his letters. I'm sure his personality was magnetic, and the way he expresses that in his letters is indeed very powerful. In fact, the challenge with writing about Michael, I think, is how to how to retain that power and yet make that hybridity and that theatricality, as you mention it, still make it human size and credible. And it's a brilliant stroke on the parts of both of you to provide a counterpoint to Michael, not only a sympathetic, friendly counterpoint, but a questioning counterpoint in the character of the young lady whom you call the Sutradhar. I'll come to that in a minute. But before that, among the points that you raised for me to talk about, the hybridity. Indian culture has been hybrid for a very long time, but more and more elements are added to that hybridity. And the new element that Michael is responding to is obviously the English language, English literature, Western culture. And he's responding to it not only his response is not wholehearted, it is more than wholehearted. It is as if he's been swept off his feet. He belongs in this with Henry Rossio, who was there before him in Calcutta. And this is the first flush of our enthusiasm for everything Western and, in particular, English. So, Michael is as great a lightning conductor of that influence as anyone that we can think of in any language in Indian literature. About hybridity, let me try and remind people who know Michael that English was not the dominant language at that time. Only in 1835 and consequently in 1837 did it begin to replace Persian. It did not do so overnight. The universities, the three presidency universities, began functioning only after the mutiny of 1857, when Michael was already 30 or more. So this is the personal enthusiasm as much as an institutional uh, beginning, an institutional initiation on a larger scale. That will come mostly later. That will affect people like Bunkim. But what Michael does is he catches something in the air, he catches something in Western culture, which is not only captivating to him, but which he turns into a form that is captivating for many people. The dominant language still is Persian. In the early 1830s, Mirza Ghalib, who wrote mostly in Persian, occasionally in Urdu, visits Calcutta, the same Calcutta which is the home of Michael. And he finds that the level of Persian in Calcutta is even higher in some respects than in Delhi. That's the kind of hybridity that we are talking about, and that underlines the distinction of a person like Michael who goes his own way. It is indeed very, very remarkable as to what Michael represents and what he does. And as I said, one of the great points about your play is that you provide a counterpoint in the shape of the Sutradhar, in the figure of the Sutradhar, a young researcher from Bangladesh, dressed in a sari, sporting a bindi, and feeling uncomfortable in the costume that she's been given. There are so many layers to her as soon as she appears. But I don't think she's quite a Sutradhar really in the traditional Sanskrit sense, in which case she would control the whole play. No, she is equally a representative of the modern reader, the modern uh, investigator, the modern curious person who goes to Michael to find out what he was about. There are figures like this, a young researcher into the past, in many, for example, in Tom Stoppart's Indian Ink, in Heat and Dust. So it's a familiar device, but the way it is used and the fact that she's from Bangladesh. But let me get back for one moment to the other point that you mentioned about his theatricality. Well, I don't know, it's very difficult. Uh, it's very difficult to figure out how some people are quiet and grave and how some people are articulate to the point of being extremely colorful and chameleon-like and theatrical and almost over-dramatic. And Michael is, to some extent, I think, self-deluded. Michael likes to project a kind of a figure which he knows is a projection, but as time passes, one suspicion is that he is actually convinced that that's what he is. And what adds further complications to this, I think, is another factor, which is that his hybridity and his theatricality find newer and newer channels of expression in real life and in literature all the time. He is a poet who wants to write in Bengali, in English, in a way that nobody has written. And then he turns right round towards the end of his life and begins writing things in Bengali that no Bengali writer has written before, both in form and content, not only Meghnadhbadh, but also the sonnets, which nobody had attempted before. And at the same time, what intrigues me very much, what makes him self-destructive, as Namita was saying, is that there's an old phrase from English literature by Dryden, I think it is, about a character who was everything by turn and nothing long. In Michael's life, the goalposts that he sets for himself, he keeps shifting all the time. It's not enough for him to be an English poet. It's then his new ambition to be a Bengali poet, such as there never has been before. But what causes the self-destruction most of all, I think, is that then he wants to be a barrister. Why was he motivated to achieve that totally different goal? Maybe because he realized that with the best poetry in the world, you can still not be a figure of such eminence and wealth in the hierarchy that the English had set up, unless you had a degree in law from England. And then you began earning money on a scale that even the British might envy in India. So these are the shifting goalposts. And this is what causes tragedy and disaster for him. It's as if he was not happy with having wooed Saraswati and having been blessed by Saraswati in two different tongues. He also wanted Lakshmi. These are the kind of paradoxes of his life, which are fascinating to the point of no one being able to exhaust him. There is, of course, a flip side to it, which is not even possible to try and make sense of Michael in the way that we make sense of other figures, however self-contradictory they may be in their own right, however various they may be in the themes they address, in the kind of experimentations that they carry out in literature. He is above everyone indeed. He is,
That's very well put.
to call him a chameleon is again an understatement. That's how I feel about it.
Wouldn't call him a chameleon, but I really like the point that you made about the paradoxical nature of his ambitions and his output, and your note on the sutradhar as to what it means in the classical sense and what we have tried to do with her as a counterpoint to Michael's story. And we are so glad to know that you find that it works to bring that counterpoint and to bring a kind of a contemporary relevance. And you're entirely right. He was moving his goalpost one thing to another, always restless, always seeking. When he could be a successful poet and a dramatist, and he was in Kolkata, he takes off for London. And then in London, when he should be practicing law, he comes right back and then decides that he's going to focus on his writing all over again. So let me now turn to Orun, who is a theatre person, a designer, a director, an actor, and a Bengali, Probashi Bengali like me, but nevertheless a person who's been deeply involved in Bengali theatre. And Orun, because I've had the privilege of knowing you for long, there is an uncanny connection that you seem to have with Michael Madhusudan Dutt, which goes beyond the formality of programming theatre performances. And you also did this incredibly attractive production for the India International Center, along with Indy. You directed it and you acted the role of Michael. So, where does Michael figure in your life and maybe in your extraordinary experiences that you may have had that you've shared with Namita and me?
Well, I have to say at the very outset that it is Namita who has to be fairly blamed for bringing Michael into my life in a way that he now has come to prevail. Fairly early on, Namita told us all how she feels like she's haunted by Michael and she has got to do something with the legacy he has left behind. And of course, I was quite charmed by the letters that she got me to read of his with her. But I hadn't yet begun to relate to him quite personally. Subsequently, on a visit to Calcutta for a family wedding, on a freak sort of incident, I chanced upon Michael's grave. Entirely on accident, and it was a chilling experience. I called Namita right there to say what had happened. I had literally stumbled upon Michael's grave in a cemetery I was visiting. I have this strange habit of visiting cemeteries. I like looking at old gravestones and so on. And I started to feel this as well, this uncanniness, Maladi, that you referred to. I started to feel it from then on. This was way back in, I think, 2006 or 7, that Michael was present, you know, and even up until this moment when we attempted to do this digital recording of the play, we attempted it with a few actors, co-actors. I attempted it with a few co-actors to read the play, to put it together. And finally, what we settled on was with my friend Inji Zeba Zahir, who lives in Vancouver, is a Bangladeshi, is familiar with Michael from school, where they had him in their curriculum, none of which I was aware of. And she brought a wealth of her own childhood associations from Bangladesh into our reading, and our own understanding of Michael's life and his work really expanded. And subsequently, when we began to edit the recordings, the Zoom recordings, into a cogent sort of sequential narrative, it turned out entirely again by accident that our editor was somebody who had read Michael in great depth as part of his comparative literature program. And here were two people who had inherited your remarkable work and were trying to make a dramatized reading of it and were connected in this uncanny kind of way. At some point felt like Michael had brought us together. And so that's the story of Michael's uncanny presence. I feel like there's some auditory disturbance. Is it coming from my side?
It's better now. Yeah.
Yeah? Okay, fine. So that's the bit about the uncanniness. As for my own experience and Inji's experience, in fact, of turning this play into its sort of digital performance, we keep calling it a digital performance, and it feels a bit strange because it is an enactment nevertheless. You know, we were at the time limited by the circumstance we all found ourselves in, and hence it could be something that we did across 2 continents. Had it not been the COVID scenario, we may have attempted to do it on stage, which would have been a totally different experience. What happened, because it had to be this sort of an enactment, was that Inji and I were trying to figure out, in the absence of the agency we would have with spatial scenography and other elements, how could we lend meaning to these characters in the absence of costume and sound and light changes and so on. And what we arrived at was that here we were, two Probashi Bangalis, Probashi, which translates quite literally as being in exile, people who are Bengalis, identify themselves as culturally belonging with Bengal and yet have lived large parts of their lives outside of Bengal. Here were two of us like this, in disparate parts of the world, relating to Michael's journey through his own life, so alive, like Dr. Trivedi was mentioning, so alive through each and every one of his vacillations. And he had been all over the place, all over the world, in his mind and in his pursuit. And that was something that both Inji and I were able to relate to in a kind of way. And our reading, our dramatic reading of the play became a way of two Bengalis, Probashi Bengalis, exploring their own sense of identity. And so we weren't actually playing the part, so to speak, technically speaking, if this play were to be done on stage, but this is how we interpreted this thing for the purposes of the present recording.
Yeah. Arun, I wonder if you will read us a short passage from the play.
Yeah, sure. So I was thinking that I would read a short bit in Bangla from Meghnadhbadh Kabya, which you all have excerpted in the book, and then follow it up with your translation. Yeah. This is Ravan, who Meghnadh has chosen as his protagonist, and Ravan is besieging Sindhu Nadi to deter the progress of Ram towards Lanka. And of course, he begins, Michael is imagining Ravan besieging Sindhu Nadi with a chastisement to start with. He's scolding the river. He's deeply offended at how the river has failed him. And so that's how he begins. And of course, then he prays and calls upon Sindhu Nadi to say that, you share my pride, and this is an affront to our pride. And now, avenge your honor, so to speak. O Bhumane Mohamani Biri Kulur Shab Rabun, Kohila Boli Sindhu Pane Chahi ki Sundar Malaji Puriacho Gale Pochet, Ha Dhik, Oho Jalo Galopati, Eiki Shaje Tumar, Olongho Ajo Tumi Hai, Eiki He Tumar Bhushon Ratnakar, Koon Gune Kaho Dev Shuni, Koon Gune Da Shorothi Kineche Tumare. Deeply offended, the imperious Ravan, a mighty bull among the heroes, gazing at the ocean, said, O wise one, what a lovely garland you wear on your neck today. Fie, O Lord of the waves, does this become thee, O indomitable, the unfathomable one? Can this be thou adornment, O ocean, thou the great jewel quarry? By which virtues, tell me, my sire, has the son of Dasharath won thee over? As mighty as the wind thou art, O great foe of the wind, what sin is it then, tell me, that makes thou bear such restraints? Rise, O mighty one, clear thy name of disrepute. Smash these barriers with all thy heroic strength, and drowning my powerful foe in these deep waters, soothe thou this burning agony. Do not endure this mark of dishonor upon thy brow, O Lord of the waters. This is my humble prayer to thee. And then Michael proceeds to reflect on his life in its entirety. This part is written in by the authors towards the end of the play. Am I the prototype of the drunken artist lost to Bacchus, kicked by Pegasus, abandoned by Parnassus? Am I the sailor in a leaky boat floundering in a sea of debt? Truly supping from the begging bowl addles the mind. Barrister Michael Madhusudan Dutt, who gets no cases and is spurned by the courts. My patient Henrietta and Albert Napoleon and Friedrich Milton Michael starve in Versailles even as I speak. Yes, I am husband to Henrietta and father to these two hapless souls. No, I'm none of these. I am the creator of Meghnadhbadh, of Sharmishta, of Padmavati. I may have forgotten the names of my children, but I remember all of whom that I have written to life. They are alive in my mind and will remain so in the minds of those who will read on after me, after I am gone, after my children's children are gone, and their children too. Yes, the world will remember King Porus, it will remember the captive lady, Shurmishta and Padmavati, Krishna Kumari will live on, and so will Tilottama. Meghnadh will straddle the stage of the world, as will Rizia, Empress of Ind. My sonnets, my poems, they will speak of me. Immortality. I have immortality. Words and literature are my life, and the rest of it, this mess of living and loving, continued, but as the excess baggage. A poet has the right to selfishness, for the poetic genius must illuminate itself before it can share its light with others. In this way, my beloved father understood this and continued to love me against the tide of my own actions. My friend Bidda, he understands the demands of a heart and a mind such as mine. I spoke my first words in Bangla, and in my epitaph I shall return to my own tongue, my sacred mother tongue. Halt, O traveler, if you were born in Bengal, tarry a while at this burial spot at the feet of Mother Earth, as a babe resting in its mother's lap, lies in his final sleep the scion of the Dattas, poet Sri Madhusudan. Shabarduri at Eshur on the banks of Kapatakko was his land of birth. His father, Rajnarayan Dutt, mother, Jannubi.
Thank you very much, Arun, for the wonderful reading and for telling us about your long involvement with the magic of Michael Madhusudan Dutt. I'll turn now to Dr. Aruna Chakravarti, who was the former principal of Janki Devi Memorial College, University of Delhi, and of course a very well-known novelist and a translator. Namita and I have often in the interviews we've been giving been asked about the legacy of Michael Madhusudan Dutt. He was indeed a powerful and multifarious character, tremendous talent, different poetic forms that he experimented with. But what did he leave to the legacy of Bengal? Oruna, you have written not only about Michael Madhusudan Dutt as part of your work on Sunil Gangopadhyay, but you're of course deeply knowledgeable about the 19th century social practices and the history of that period. Now, I'm particularly referring to Sunilda's book Sheishamai, in which there is a chapter and fairly lengthy references to Michael Madhusudan Dutt. So, would you like to tell us more about this, since you're very closely involved with that whole period, and your translation is absolutely brilliant. So, where does Michael Madhusudan Dutt figure in this legacy of Bengali literature, according to Sunilda and according to your translation?
Well, there's absolutely no doubt that Michael Madhusudan was one of the luminaries, perhaps one of the greatest luminaries of the Bengal Renaissance. Now, since I have translated Sheishamai, English those days, I would like to speak about the way Shunilda has represented Michael Madhusudan in his book. It's not a complete representation. I would say that it is certainly a fair representation. Like whatever he has written about him is based on documented sources, but it's not complete because we know nothing about his childhood. We are not told anything about his childhood. Neither are we told anything about his death. or the 3 years prior to his death. And that, of course, is because Shunilda is doing something, specific in those days. He's writing a history of Bengal, or rather, history of Calcutta, during the period between 1840 and 1870, in which he felt that during these 30 years, the Bengal Renaissance really flowered. And during this period, many great men, many luminaries, eminent personalities were living and working. And there were different kinds of people. They came from all streams of life. There were poets, literateurs, educationists, both English and native. There were social workers, social reformers, religious reformers, and even some budding nationalists, because the Bengal Renaissance actually saw the first stirrings of nationalism in India. So Michael Madhusudan, of course, is a very important part of this movement. And personally, I am a great admirer of Michael, and I believe he is possibly one of the greatest, if not the greatest. But Shunilda actually, his story, Michael's life, is actually basically shown in two phases. As I said, the childhood has been left out. The death and the 3 years prior to his death has been left out because they don't fit into that 30-year time frame that Shunilda set for himself. Another large chunk which is left out is his years in Madras, which again, since he wasn't in Kolkata, Shunilda passed it over. But two distinct images of Michael as a man and a writer emerged in those days. And in the first part, he is depicted as a college boy, a boy of 16, studying in Presidency College, which was then known as Hindu College. A brilliant student, passionately fond of English poetry, in fact, passionately fond of everything English. And this is the way Shunil Gangobadhai has represented him. That he frankly has no problem with in England's colonization of India. He has no problems with whatever is happening. All the iniquities that the natives are suffering at the hands of the rulers. He doesn't. He's in a sense living in a world of his own, in an illusory world, in which he feels that he's more English than Indian. He feels that he's an Englishman trapped in a Indian skin, so to speak. I'm just talking about how Shunilda represents him. He's spoiled, he's wayward, he's pampered. He has no connection with the reality of life. He has no idea of what people like Ram Mohan Roy and Bida Shagur are doing, because he has no idea about, he's not interested in what is happening to the people of the country, to the women and to the lower classes, etc. Actually, he is biding time. He's just waiting to go to England and assume his identity, which he really believes is an English identity. He believes that he's cut out to be a great English poet, and he has to go to England, and then it'll come. Everything will follow automatically. So this is the kind of young man that Shunil Gangobadhai portrays. A man cut off from reality, living in his own world, in his own ivory tower, and of course, and he becomes a Christian, and then some difficulties follow. His father disinherits him, and he's he has been lured into becoming a Christian with the hope of being sent to England, which doesn't happen. So he is really at the point when he is cut off from his father's support. The story ends. The story of his youth kind of ends. Then Shunil Gangobadhai passes over the next 10, 12 years, and after which he returns to Kolkata at the age of 32, and his father is dead. He hopes to reclaim his property. And it is this at this period, and after that he stays on in Calcutta. Of course, for a brief period he goes to England to study at the bar. But and this period is really the most important period, and this is the period that makes Madhusudhan what he actually is. See, because when he comes, he's kind of drawn into the vortex of the Bengal Renaissance. He meets many literary personalities, other personalities, and gradually he's sort of had a few knocks. He's become a sadder, if not a really wiser man, a little wiser possibly, but he comes back, and he still has this. He dismisses everything indigenous. Very
So,
frankly,
you
he
know what?
dismisses everything.
It's very interesting what you're saying about this important period when Michael is part of the map that Shunilda is putting for Bengal at that time, and the contemporaries that he meets. Before I move on, I'd like to tell all our listeners that it's time to put in your questions, please, in the chat box, because we will have a little time for taking any queries that you might have with any of the speakers or in general. So, Oruna, the book has the letters that Michael Madhusudan Dutt wrote to Vidyasagar. And I completely see the point that you're making, though you're quoting Shunilda there, that there was a lot happening in Bengal at that time. But Michael Madhusudan Dutt's letters to Vidyasagar are entirely located in the personal realm of his problems with his inheritance, that he needed the money. He's not showing that much interest in what's going on in Bengal at that time. So, Harish, I'm going to take you up on one point that you made. And this is about the possible contemporary relevance of our play in presenting Michael Madhusudan Dutt as a hybrid character, somebody who's constantly battling with challenges, a person who's living in split surreal worlds at all times. Do you think there is a contemporary relevance to him and the way we've presented that aspect in our play?
Yes, indeed. Yes. It seems to me that what Michael himself was doing, and even more than that, how Michael was representing himself in his letters, in his actions, in the many turns that his life took, all those have one kind of lasting impact on our culture and our literature, and it needs to be relativized by placing it against other influences of his contemporaries or figures who followed shortly after in the long 19th century. So, the best way of understanding what he was doing and what he was writing, it seems to me, is again to place some other figures all around him so that there is a kind of contextualization from what Aruna was saying. I mean, look at Vidyasagar. Vidyasagar is in actually, he has a greater long term impact than Michael in so many ways. Michael is a blazing figure. As some people have said, Kishore Das, I think, said that he's a comet. I think he's a meteor. If he were a comet, he'd come back reincarnated sometime soon, or might have come already. No. It seems to me that there is a huge flash which lights up the whole landscape. And then there are these bits of a star falling off, which again we can see, not only in Bengali. Bankim, for example, he begins with English and he comes back very, very quickly to Bengali and makes kind of a contribution. If Tagore, I mean, this is blasphemy. If Tagore had not been born and lived and written, then Michael would be a much more interesting and bigger figure. But again, Tagore's harmonious work, harmonizing the East and the West, Bengali and English, again became gold standard in a way that makes Michael seem quite extreme. And one little other point that I wish to make is This is, of course, as has been pointed out by everybody, is a peculiarly Bengali phenomenon. As you know, I read Bengali a little bit in the original. I read a lot of it in translation. It is, I mean, in the 19th century, that's the dominant literature in India, and even into the 20th. At the same time, every language in India, every major language, has a major 19th century figure who has taken pains to learn English, who is open to being influenced by English, who has modernized the language and literature of that particular area, and who has left behind works which are totally canonical. A figure, for example, like Bharatendu Harishchandra in Hindi. Now, what does Bharatendu have, which we can put beside Michael to appreciate Michael better and also Bharatendu better? Bharatendu has English. Bharatendu has something that is not remarkable in the case of Michael, but is remarkable in his case. He has Bengali, he has Urdu, and of course he has Hindi, and he has Sanskrit, which Michael also had. I mean, to have Bengali is to have Sanskrit, more so than in the case of Hindi. I've always believed that. So there is a kind of a bedrock, a multifarious, multicolored bedrock in terms of language and culture that writers in other parts bring to the English influence, and therefore is absorbed in different ways than in the case of Derozio and Michael. They happen early on in the 19th century, and they are, I mean, it's like fireworks, what they do. And then Kipling mocked Bengalis, some Bengalis, as trying to be more English than the English. It has just been pointed out that perhaps in Sunil Gangopadhyay's opinion, Michael was a prime example of that category. But there are other people who are negotiating Western culture, English language, English literature, and the influence in different ways. And Michael forms a very distinctive voice in that whole orchestra.
Thank you, Harish. I'm going to turn to Aruna Chakravarti, please. Aruna, you are a person who has combined history and fiction in very significant ways in your writing. And the questions are coming in here. And I was just wondering if you'd like to say a little bit, very briefly, as to what is the challenge of combining history and fiction, as we have also tried to do in our play. And then we will immediately move on to several questions which have come. Aruna.
Certainly the challenges are huge because history is, after all, just a record of dates, events, and the personalities around whom these events occurred, usually names or at best cardboard characters. But when you're writing historical fiction, you have to recreate that world, recreate a bygone era, and make it recognizable. Sort of flesh out the characters, give them attributes, personalities, even offer insights into the deepest spaces of their being, their thoughts, their feelings, their dreams, aspirations. And this is where the fiction part of it comes in. Now it's a very tightrope walk. It's very difficult to do because if you hold yourself too close to the facts that you've collected, then your work tends to become a bit dry, prosaic. And if you let your imagination run away with you, then it loses authenticity. So what the biggest challenge in front of the writer of historical fiction, though I would call myself a writer of biofiction because my work, both The Inheritors and the Joda Shako books are about families, not history of a particular time, the way Shulil Gangopadhyay was doing in those days in First Light. So basically, that balance has to be kept, and the more skillfully that balance is maintained, the better the novel. Besides, when you're writing a novel, a historical novel, it has to have a narrative, a flowing narrative. So the events that you've picked up are disconnected, and so you have to form the connections, and you can only form the connections with fictional interludes, fictional elements, and that's the way the structure has to be designed, because when the reader is reading a book, he wants to read a continuous narrative. There should be a flow. There should not be any jarring element, sudden gaps in what is happening. And this is sometimes very difficult, because sometimes the facts that you collect themselves contradict each other.
So,
Sometimes.
well, you're entirely right about being very careful about the fictional element and trying not to go overboard, and the bio fiction part of it. So, well, we tried that Sutradhar character that Harish also commented on. We hope is working. So we have another 10 minutes or so, and there are questions coming in. There is Mandira Sen from Kolkata who says, could you discuss some views of his contemporary writers on Michael? Anyone there would like to pick it up? From the point of view of the play, Mandira, we have looked at the criticism of his English poetry that came from people like Bethune. And in fact, it was so damaging to his self opinion and perhaps his reputation that criticism made Michael turn to writing in Bangla. Now, when we're talking of the later period, Harish mentioned Tagore. Well, we can't wish him away. There he is, big and large, very influential. Tagore had different opinions about Michael at different times of his career. He began by having certain adverse thoughts about Michael, thought he was very flamboyant, etc. But later on, he began to recognize the virtue and talent that Michael had. So I hope that answers your question, Mandira. The next one from Abhilasha Kumari in Delhi is specifically for Harish. In Meghnadhbadh, does Dutt finally recognize the meaning of colonialism with reference to the fact that he humanizes the South Indians?
Well, colonialism can be used in many different contexts and put to different purposes. And I'm sure Abhilasha is right that there may be an element of what the British did to Indians in Michael's treatment of what the North Indians were doing. She calls them South Indians. I think they're Sri Lankans. So I think there's an important, delicate point to be made there by way of a nuance. Yes, there's one way of interpreting it, sure. But so far as the colonial impact is concerned, let's begin by recognizing that it is imbibed by Michael in ways which are not only revisionist, as Abhilasha is suggesting, but in fact fairly straightforward. If Paradise Lost had not been written, and if Michael were not so fond of Milton, I think that it would have been very difficult for him to conceive of writing Meghnadhbadh. It has been said about Milton that he was of Satan's party without knowing it. In Michael's case, he was of Meghnad's party, knowing full well what he was trying to do. And that was, one cannot say that it's just the influence of Milton on Michael. There have been revisionist writings of the Ramayana right from the beginning, even in Sanskrit. Radical rewritings, Uttar Ramcharitam, for example, has very little to do with the view that Valmiki propagated. Adhyatma Ramayana, for example, tells a very different kind of philosophical tale about Rama. So there have been, Ravana was more than humanized already in legend. He was a great Sanskrit Pandit. He was the greatest worshipper of Shiva alive in the world. He was blessed by Kuber. he was not only a Rakshas. That is one way of looking at him. So he'd been humanized and even deified by other people who were around then. And Michael also came and did his bit by him. Yes, particularly Meghnadhbadh. The speech that was read by Arun and the Ravana and the Sindhu thing. There are many versions of that. And if you go into the Ramayana story, the most fascinating thing is that you have at least 20, 30 major versions spread out right there. And they range from the most conventional to the most radical. It's already been done. It's very difficult to conceive of doing something either conventional or radical that goes beyond that range, I think.
Thank you very much, Harish. Namita, maybe you'd like to come in at this point. There is a question here from Lalji. Did Michael write about the relationship between God and man? It sort of links up with what Harish was saying about Milton, and Namita might want to talk about how we worked with a different title before we came to Betrayed by Hope.
Well, in my opinion, he does not engage with the gods as Hindus do. There are many gods who we engage with in ancient times who was in his conversion to Christianity looking at a single god. But somewhere I was never convinced about his relationship with that god or with the Christian theology. I think somewhere he was in love with the culture, the Eurocentric culture, the culture of the colonizers, and the access it gave him. Uh, he was Promethean in his impulsion, and he believed in man, not in God, is clear from his writings. He was so contrarian to accept, I think, the the authority of any god that and indeed in all my reading I found a lot of ethical uh, complaints about how Indian society is like this or it is like that, but it is not about the uh, it is not about the Christian God being more accessible or kinder or more compassionate than the Indian gods. He thought he was a god himself. And that was his greatest strength. He said, I shall come out like a tremendous comet. But he believed in himself in a way very few people in his age believed in themselves, both inside and outside of society, is my view.
Is pretty much what comes through in his letters. And for the person who asked this question, Lalji, Namita and I had a working title which was Byron in Kolkata. Because along with the kind of ideas of God that Milton had, or the relationship between God and man, as you've asked, Byron was another person who wanted to see what is the place of man on earth, man meaning humankind on earth. And Michael was fascinated with Byron and tried to emulate that kind of egotistical slant when you are the measure of all important things in the world around you. So we are close to the end of our 1 hour session, and I'd like to thank all the speakers for sharing their viewpoints, their knowledge, their expertise, and also for reading our play with so much care, affection, and alertness. And indeed, also
Ma-
want to express our gratitude to the listeners. Namita, over to
yes.
you.
I'd like to say this, Mala, that today I had auto muted myself in the sense I didn't have much to say today simply because I knew that what our speakers had to say was so valuable from their different perspectives. I was eager to hear it. I was not disappointed. Thank you, Aruna, for those deep insights. Thank you, Harish, for giving us so much understanding of what we try to show through our letters of Michael. And thank you, Arun, for that magnificent reading. And unlike a book, a novel, which is open to interpretation for the reader, there is another level in a play. And I know that all those people, there are some plays being planned, one for Dhaka and Bangladesh, one for California. When these plays are done, all the people who produce them, who act in them, will find your comments extremely useful, your readings, your understanding, as they get into the perplexing and magnificent character of my friend, our friend, Michael Madhusudan Dutt.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And
Thank you, Namita.
IIC Library and Usha Munshi for bringing us all together this afternoon.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.